This content is for entertainment purposes. What happens when a Democratic senator, a man who is supposed to be one of the party's most reliable progressive warriors, commits the unforgivable sin of treating the incoming president with basic human decency and profession respect? What unfolds isn't just another political disagreement on a daytime talk show. It's a reckoning. It's the moment when the mask slips off completely, revealing the authoritarian impulses lurking beneath progressive rhetoric about unity and healing and working together. This is the story of how John Fetterman walked into The View prepared to explain a perfectly reasonable meeting with President-elect Trump only to face a tribunal of hosts who couldn't comprehend that talking to political opponents doesn't constitute treason, and how his common-sense response exposed the complete intellectual bankruptcy of a panel that claims to champion dialogue while practicing ideological excommunication. Before we dive into this extraordinary confrontation, understand what you're witnessing. This isn't just about one senator visiting Mar-a-Lago or one panel of hosts disagreeing with that decision. This is about the fundamental sickness infecting American political discourse, the transformation of political opponents into existential enemies, the treatment of basic professional courtesy as moral betrayal, and the shocking reality that suggesting cooperation with a democratically elected president now qualifies as controversial in certain circles. The View's reaction to Fetterman's perfectly reasonable decision to meet with Trump crystallized everything wrong with Trump derangement syndrome, exposing hosts who claim to want bipartisanship while attacking anyone who actually practices it. What you're about to read is the anatomy of ideological capture so complete that common sense becomes revolutionary, and how one senator's refusal to play tribal games made him a hero to millions who are exhausted by the endless partisan warfare. The setup for this confrontation began not on the View set, but at Joint Base Andrews, where John Fetterman, the hoodie-wearing, straight-talking Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, stood before reporters and committed an act that would send shockwaves through the progressive establishment. He announced without apology or equivocation that he was heading down to Mar-a-Lago to meet with President-elect Donald Trump. The reaction from the assembled press was immediate and predictable. Cameras clicked frantically. Reporters shouted questions over each other, their voices carrying a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed outrage. A Democratic senator, not just any Democrat, but John Fetterman, who'd been celebrated as a progressive champion when he defeated Dr. Oz in a brutal Pennsylvania race, was voluntarily meeting with Trump. The man progressives had spent 8 years calling a fascist, a dictator, an existential threat to democracy itself. "What do you plan on talking about with the president?" one reporter demanded, the question loaded with accusation disguised as curiosity. Fetterman's response was vintage. Fetterman blunt, humorous, completely unfiltered. "I'm asking to be named the Pope of Greenland." He deadpanned, his Pennsylvania accent making the absurdist humor even more effective. The reporters didn't laugh. They wanted a real answer. Wanted him to acknowledge the gravity of his transgression against progressive orthodoxy. Another reporter pressed, "Do you have a specific agenda?" And here, Fetterman delivered the statement that would define this entire controversy. The words that would become a rallying cry for Americans exhausted by tribal politics and desperate for elected officials who remember they work for all their constituents, not just the ones who voted for them. "I'm just having a conversation," Fetterman began. His tone, matter of fact, as if explaining something so obvious it shouldn't require explanation. "This is going to be the president, and I am not just the senator for Democrats in Pennsylvania. I'm the senator for everyone in Pennsylvania, and my state picked Donald Trump as president." He paused, letting that fundamental fact sink in. Pennsylvania, the state that sent him to Washington, had also chosen Trump. This wasn't some red state where Democratic senators had to occasionally make nice with Republican voters for electoral survival. This was Fetterman's own constituents making a clear choice. "And if I have the opportunity to have that conversation," Fetterman continued, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd thought deeply about this decision and reached a conclusion he was prepared to defend, "I bet we're going to find things to work together on for a better Pennsylvania and a better nation. And that's why I'm engaging in this." It was a statement of such basic common sense, such elementary understanding of how a representative democracy is supposed to function that it should have been unremarkable. A senator representing constituents who'd chosen a president deciding to talk with that president about issues affecting those constituents. This was Civics 101, the most fundamental obligation of elected office. But in the ideologically captured landscape of modern progressive politics, common sense had become revolutionary. And John Fetterman was about to discover just how revolutionary his perfectly normal decision would be treated by the gatekeepers of acceptable democratic behavior. The View studio buzzed with the particular energy that comes when hosts sense blood in the water. John Fetterman's announcement had given them a target, an opportunity to perform their ideological purity for an audience that expected nothing less than complete denunciation of anyone who dared treat as a legitimate political figure rather than a cartoon villain. The panel assembled that morning represented the full spectrum of The View's approach to politics, from Whoopi Goldberg's theatrical outrage to Joy Behar's sneering dismissiveness to Sunny host's prosecutorial aggression. And they were ready to deliver judgment on John Fetterman's heresy. Whoopi opened the segment with practiced concern, her tone suggesting she was about to discuss something deeply troubling. John Fetterman is taking a lot of heat apparently for taking this trip, she said, framing Fetterman's decision as inherently controversial, as something requiring defense rather than simple acknowledgement. But do you think his reasons are sound? It was a setup question, an invitation for the panel to tear into Fetterman's justification and expose it as the shameful political calculation they clearly believed it was. What none of them anticipated was that one of their own would break ranks and commit an even greater heresy, defending Fetterman's decision with actual reasoning. Alyssa Farah Griffin, the token conservative voice on the panel who'd built her reputation on being the acceptable Republican, someone who criticized Trump reliably enough to maintain her liberal media credentials, surprised everyone by responding with genuine respect for Fetterman's position. "It's the most common-sense answer I've ever heard," Alyssa began, her voice carrying none of the expected condemnation, like he's a senator to an entire state, and his state happened to turn for Donald Trump. So more than half of that state voted for the person that's becoming president. She was laying out basic democratic principles that elected officials represent all their constituents, that respecting electoral outcomes is fundamental to democratic governance, that talking to the winning presidential candidate from your state is not just acceptable, but expected. You're a senator, heading into 13 hearings of confirmation. Alyssa continued, building her case with the patience of someone who understood she was about to face serious pushback. Your job on paper is to advise and consent. That's all we ask, and that's what he's doing. It was a devastating defense because it was so obviously correct. Fetterman wasn't abandoning his principles or betraying his voters or selling out his party. He was doing exactly what senators are supposed to do: engage with the executive branch on behalf of their constituents, find areas of potential cooperation, fulfill the constitutional role of advice and consent. But Sunny host couldn't let that stand unchallenged. The suggestion that meeting with Trump could be justified threatened the entire framework of resistance politics that had defined progressive identity for 8 years. If Trump was someone you could meet with professionally, someone you could work with on specific issues, then he wasn't the Hitler figure that justified treating his supporters as deplorables and his administration as an illegitimate regime. I have to say, Sunny jumped in, her voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. I don't like the optics of him going down to Mar-a-Lago because I think that's become kind of like, Donald Trump's little palace, and it's like going down to Mecca to see the prophet. The metaphor was telling Sunny was positioning Mar-a-Lago not as a presidential transition headquarters, but as a religious shrine. Trump not as an elected official, but as a cult leader. And Fetterman's visit not as professional courtesy, but as ideological apostasy. A pilgrimage to pay homage to a false god. So, I don't like that. Sunny continued, her face twisted with distaste, as if describing something morally repugnant. And it feels like he's yucking it up. Yucking it up. The phrase revealed everything about Sunny's mindset. The idea that Fetterman might have a pleasant professional conversation with Trump was itself offensive. Politics in Sunny's worldview should be warfare constant, bitter, unrelenting. Any gesture towards civility, any moment of treating the opposition as fellow humans rather than existential enemies constituted collaboration with evil. But then Sunny, did something fascinating. She accidentally revealed that she knew her position was hypocritical and historically illiterate. This used to be normal, she admitted, her voice carrying reluctance, as if acknowledging an inconvenient truth she wished she could ignore. Presidents having relationships with people from the other party to get things done used to be normal. She provided examples, historical precedents that undermined her entire argument. Ronald Reagan famously had a very good relationship with Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, a Democrat, when he was president. We saw Joe Biden work very closely with Mitt Romney, with Rob Portman, with many Republicans to get bipartisan legislation passed. Every example she cited proved Fetterman's point that working across party lines, maintaining professional relationships with political opponents, finding areas of agreement despite broader disagreements. This was how American government was supposed to function. This was the normal practice of democracy. But then came the pivot. The moment when Sunny revealed that all her appeals to historical precedent and democratic norms were actually irrelevant. Because while those things used to matter, while bipartisan cooperation used to be celebrated, none of that applied anymore. And why not? The problem is Donald Trump is not normal. There it was. The Trump card, pun intended, that justified abandoning every principle, every precedent, every standard of democratic governance. Trump is different. Trump is special. Trump is so uniquely dangerous that all the rules change. All the norms get suspended. All the traditional expectations of how elected officials should behave no longer apply. And so, what used to be normal becomes something that we talk about, Sunny continued. Her logic completing its circular journey back to condemning the very bipartisan cooperation she just celebrated in other contexts. Then came the conditional approval that revealed the authoritarian impulse beneath progressive rhetoric. I think John Fetterman frankly is right, but I hope that does not mean that he won't call out the abuses of power, that he won't criticize him when there is legitimate. The sentence trailed off unfinished, but the message was clear. Fetterman could meet with Trump, but only if he maintained the proper posture of resistance. Only if he made clear he was engaging under protest. Only if he continued treating Trump as fundamentally illegitimate, even while working with him. Professional cooperation was acceptable only if accompanied by constant condemnation. It was a position so incoherent, so obviously contradictory, that it demanded pushback. And the pushback, when it came, would expose just how far the View had drifted from anything resembling reasoned political analysis. The breakdown of the View's position reached its crescendo when the panel attempted to articulate what specific abuses of power Trump had committed that justified their extraordinary hostility, and came up completely empty. Alyssa, perhaps sensing the weakness in Sunny's argument, pressed the question that millions of viewers were thinking: what exactly did Donald Trump do that was so wrong in this scenario right here? He invited John Fetterman to have a conversation with him at Mar-a-Lago. Why is that such a bad idea? Why is that such a bad thing for the future president to have a conversation with a senator? It was a perfectly reasonable question, demanding a specific answer. What abuse of power was Trump committing by inviting a senator to discuss issues? What authoritarian behavior was he demonstrating by engaging in normal transition activities? The panel had no answer. Sunny sputtered about optics in the ring kissing, but couldn't articulate any actual wrongdoing, because there was none. Trump was doing exactly what every president-elect does, meeting with senators, discussing legislative priorities, building relationships across party lines to facilitate governance. But acknowledging that would require admitting that perhaps the 8-year narrative of Trump as uniquely dangerous, as categorically different from all previous presidents, as someone who justifies abandoning all normal political practices. Perhaps that narrative was always more about partisan warfare than genuine principle. The cognitive dissonance reached almost comical levels. When the panel pivoted to discussing Trump's Greenland comments, treating his provocative statements about potentially acquiring the territory as evidence of his unfitness for office, while simultaneously revealing their own ignorance of strategic realities. I want him to stop talking about Greenland, Sunny declared with exasperation. Greenland is not for sale. Why is Donald Trump talking about Greenland? Anna Navarro jumped in with her theory. You know why he's talking about Greenland? Because it has oil and natural resources. That's what he wants. He wants money. It was pure projection, attributing the most cynical possible motives to Trump while ignoring the actual strategic importance of Greenland in an era of increasing Arctic competition with Russia and China. The idea that a president might consider American interests in the Arctic, might think about critical mineral resources and military positioning, never seemed to cross the panel's minds. He's talking about Greenland, so we don't talk about how bad some of his appointments are, Anna continued, revealing the real issue. Everything Trump did was interpreted as distraction, as manipulation, as evidence of nefarious intent. The possibility that he might actually mean what he said, might actually be thinking strategically about American interests, couldn't be entertained. I think he cares about being distractor chief, Anna concluded, accidentally revealing that the View panel's obsession with Trump's every statement was the actual distraction keeping them from substantive policy discussion. Alyssa attempted to inject some geopolitical reality into the conversation. We also have U.S. troops in Greenland, though. There's some national security reasons that we care about the Arctic and having, but Anna wasn't interested in nuance or strategic thinking. He doesn't care about that. She interrupted. That is not the reason he's given. I don't think he cares about that. The arrogance was breathtaking. Anna Navarro, a political commentator with no background in military strategy or Arctic geopolitics, confidently declaring what the president-elect did or didn't care about, based purely on her personal interpretation of his motives. This was mind-reading as political analysis, psychological projection, masquerading as insight. The panel's treatment of the Greenland issue perfectly encapsulated their broader approach to Trump. Dismiss any stated reason for his actions. Assume the worst possible motives. Interpret everything through the lens of personal corruption or distraction. And above all, never engage seriously with the actual strategic or policy considerations that might justify his positions. It was lazy analysis disguised as moral clarity. And it revealed hosts who'd spent so long treating Trump as a cartoon villain that they'd lost the ability to engage with him as a serious political figure whose actions might actually be motivated by genuine policy considerations rather than pure malevolence. But the most revealing moment of the entire segment came when Joy Behar accidentally articulated a principle that completely undermined the View's position while thinking she was making a clever point. Then he can talk all he wants, Joy declared, establishing her red line. As long as there are no troops heading to Panama, to Greenland, to Canada, to Mexico, all of these are sovereign nations. As long as they're just talking, let him talk. Let him talk as long as it stays that way. It was meant to be a warning, a statement of vigilance against Trump's supposedly expansionist ambition. But what Joy had actually done was perfectly articulate. Why Fetterman meeting with Trump was not just acceptable but necessary. Because talking is how you prevent conflicts, how you find diplomatic solutions, how you establish relationships that might constrain bad behavior or facilitate good governance. If Trump talking about Greenland was acceptable, as long as it remained talk rather than military action, then surely Fetterman talking with Trump about Pennsylvania issues was not just acceptable, but exactly what senators should do. The entire premise of The View's criticism that meeting with Trump somehow legitimized or enabled dangerous behavior collapsed under the weight of their own logic. But acknowledging this would require intellectual consistency, which had long ago been sacrificed on the altar of resistance politics. The segment concluded with the panel maintaining their posture of suspicious tolerance. Fetterman could meet with Trump, but they'd be watching, judging, ready to pounce the moment he failed to maintain proper oppositional hostility. It was conditional acceptance that revealed the authoritarian impulse at the heart of their politics. You're free to engage in bipartisan cooperation only if you do so while maintaining the correct ideological attitude. What the View panel failed to recognize in their rush to judgment was that they'd accidentally created a hero by attacking Fetterman for doing something obviously reasonable. By treating basic professional courtesy as requiring defense by suggesting that talking to a democratically elected president was somehow controversial. They positioned him as the voice of sanity in an asylum of partisan madness. Social media exploded with reactions that universally sided with Fetterman against the View's attacks. Holy cow, I cannot believe it. Common sense was uttered on The View. One viral post exclaimed, "There are things that you can agree with Donald Trump on. Oh my gosh, this is so revolutionary. How did we not know this before?" The sarcasm was biting, but reflected genuine frustration with a political culture that had become so tribal that suggesting cooperation with the opposition now qualified as radical. Another comment captured this perfectly. "I don't care what political affiliation you are, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Independent, as long as you have the best interest of America, I'm going to agree with you. That's how it should be in Washington, D.C." It was a sentiment that transcended partisan affiliation. A recognition that the view's demand for perpetual warfare regardless of circumstance was exhausting and counterproductive. People wanted their elected officials to actually govern, to find areas of agreement to solve problems rather than engage in endless performative resistance. John Fetterman, "I have a lot of respect for this man." Another widely shared post read, "I thought he was going to be the worst senator in America's history when he was debating Dr. Oz. He couldn't even read clearly. Had trouble with his speech after his stroke. Was supporting very radical policies. But I'll tell you what, he turned a new leaf because he seems right now more rational than some Republicans, the Mitch McConnells and Lindsey Grahams of the world. I respect the heck out of him for being willing to talk to Donald Trump and discuss the issues facing America." This sentiment was particularly powerful because it came from someone who'd been prepared to write Fetterman off based on his progressive credentials and his challenging debate performances following his stroke. Instead, Fetterman's willingness to engage across party lines had earned respect from people who would never vote for him, but could appreciate a politician who took his representational duties seriously. The contrast between Fetterman's approach and the View's reaction crystallized a growing divide in American politics, not between left and right, but between those who saw politics as total warfare, requiring complete opposition to the other side, versus those who understood that democracy requires finding common ground, even with people you disagree with on most issues. The View represented the former a politics of perpetual resistance, where any gesture toward the opposition constitutes betrayal. Fetterman represented the latter, a recognition that elected officials have obligations that transcend partisan loyalty, that constituents deserve representation regardless of how they voted, and that governance requires talking to people you might not like. What made Fetterman's position so threatening to the View's worldview was its undeniability. His argument was airtight. Pennsylvania voted for Trump. Fetterman represents Pennsylvania. Therefore, Fetterman should talk to Trump about Pennsylvania issues. It was syllogism so simple that attacking it required abandoning basic logic in favor of pure emotional appeals about Trump's unique danger. The host's inability to articulate specific harms from Fetterman meeting with Trump revealed the bankruptcy of their position. They could gesture vaguely at optics and ring-kissing and worry about abuses of power. But when pressed for specifics, they had nothing because there was nothing. A senator meeting with a president-elect to discuss shared constituents' concerns was not just normal, it was obligatory. The Greenland discussion further exposed the View's intellectual poverty. Instead of engaging with the actual strategic considerations around Arctic competition, critical minerals, and military positioning, they defaulted to the laziest possible interpretation. Trump wants money. It was analysis unburdened by knowledge, certainty unencumbered by understanding, and it revealed hosts who'd become so committed to their narrative of Trump as uniquely venal that they couldn't engage seriously with policy considerations. The most damning aspect of the entire segment was how it exposed the View's hypocrisy. They celebrated bipartisan cooperation when it happened under Obama or Biden. They praised Democratic engagement with Republicans when it advanced progressive priorities. But when a Democrat dared to extend professional courtesy to Trump, suddenly all those principles evaporated, replaced by accusations of collaboration and demands for perpetual resistance. This was politics as team sport taken to its logical extreme, where winning matters more than governing, where opposing the other side takes precedence over representing constituents, where maintaining ideological purity trumps actually accomplishing anything useful. John Fetterman's simple act of meeting with Trump exposed all of this in a way that no amount of political analysis could. By doing something obviously reasonable and defending it with unassailable logic, he forced the View panel to reveal that their commitment to democratic norms, bipartisan cooperation, and representative government was purely conditional acceptable when advancing their side, treasonous when extended to the opposition. What started as an attempt to shame Fetterman for meeting with Trump became an accidental exposure of the View's authoritarian impulses, their intellectual bankruptcy, and their fundamental unseriousness as political commentators. They thought they were holding a wayward Democrat accountable. Instead, they made him look like the only adult in a room full of partisan hacks who'd forgotten that elections have consequences and democracy requires talking to people you disagree with. Millions of Americans watching that segment came to a simple conclusion. If The View thinks meeting with the president-elect is controversial, then The View has lost the plot entirely. And if John Fetterman is willing to do the right thing despite their criticism, then maybe there's hope for American politics after all, not because everyone will suddenly agree, but because at least some elected officials remember that their job is representing constituents, not performing ideological purity for partisan audiences. The View tried to prosecute John Fetterman for common sense. Instead, they accidentally crowned him as a champion of sanity in an increasingly insane political culture. And in doing so, they revealed that the real threat to democratic norms isn't politicians who talk to each other across party lines. It's commentators who've convinced themselves that such conversations constitute betrayal. John Fetterman walked into that discussion prepared to explain a perfectly reasonable meeting. He walked out vindicated, celebrated by millions who are desperate for politicians who govern rather than perform, who represent all their constituents rather than just the partisan faithful, and who understand that democracy dies not when people talk to their opponents, but when they refuse to.